Welcome to the MyPersonalFootballCoach.com Youth Soccer Player Development Podcast, Episode 4 with Nick Grantham.
Welcome to MyPersonalFootballCoach.com Soccer Player Development Podcast. Discover all the secrets, hints and tips about soccer player development and soccer coaching from some of the leading figures in world soccer. Here's your host, Saul Isaacson Hurst.
Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of the MyPersonalFootballCoach.com Youth Soccer Player Development Podcast. Now this week I've got a great guest, someone I first met when I was doing the Advanced Youth Award at the FA. He's a sports and conditioning specialist. He consults not only with the FA and Premier League clubs like West Bromwich Albion, but also works across elite sport with Olympians, many different other sports. So he really knows what he's talking about, and I think it's important now as time's gone on now. I've noticed a real big now improvement in the utilisation of sports and conditioning experts in football. Whereas when I first started out, maybe it was a bit of an afterthought. Now they really are being utilised, and it's become a really important part of elite player development, trying to produce athletes for football, for the Premier League and Champions League. So I'm really excited about that. Myself, just got quite a busy week ahead. I'm going to Geneva for a conference, the Football Development and E-Learning Conference, and then to the NSCAA in January in LA, which I'm really excited about. Anyone wants to connect, just let me know. It'd be great to speak to other coaches out there, maybe directors of coaching. And then March I've got coming up another camp I'm doing in Edmonton, Canada. So busy times, really excited, and lots more to do, and some really excellent podcasts coming up. So hope you enjoy. So hi, Nick Grantham, welcome to the show.
Morning, Saul. How you doing? Thanks for having me on.
Thanks very much, mate. Can you just give us a little bit of background about yourself? You know, what you do, sort of organisations you've worked for in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked in high performance sport for about the last 20 years, getting on for 20 years now. I've been very fortunate that that's afforded me the opportunity to work across a wide range of sports, 35, and that's from able-bodied to Paralympians, team sports, individual sports, and athletes that have competed at the last 4 Olympics, starting from Sydney in 2000 right the way through to my final involvement in a significant role at London 2012. As well as that, so I now work as a consultant to a variety of teams and individuals, so currently consulting in professional football. And I've worked in football in a number of levels, from championship to premiership through to international football and the women's game, and also worked with a pro golfer. So it's a fairly eclectic bunch, but I think what it allows me to bring, particularly to football, is a fresh perspective and a fresh set of eyes on what can sometimes be quite a traditional environment in terms of working practices and training philosophies.
Excellent. So, I remember when I first started in academy football over 10 years ago, there wasn't really that much of a relationship between the sports science department, if there was any, and the academy. But obviously, then through a few years into my work at Spurs, then that became much more integrated and then really developed now. And I noticed where the clubs I've worked at and other clubs now, it's really become an important staple of that work with young players. Have you noticed that then recently, that change in trend, that maybe the more importance given to it?
I think certainly over the last sort of 15, 20 years since I've been working sports science, strength and conditioning and physical preparation have all become an integral part of the performance on the pitch. I think it's going through a sort of a growth and a development phase where, in the early days it probably wasn't particularly well received. There wasn't probably great communication between practitioners from the sports science side of the fence and also the coaching. I think people were talking different languages and maybe had different priorities. My experience now is that seeing sports science and medicine teams both at academy level and at first team level, on the whole, the communication is much better, the understanding of each other's roles and how they can impact on performance on the pitch, which is what everyone wants at the end of the day. The coaches want the best players. The sports science and medicine team want the best players on the pitch. You want to be with a successful team. I think the communication is far better. It can always improve. It can always improve. We can always deepen our understandings of each other's areas and how that impacts. But I think it's certainly better than maybe 5, 10 years ago.
So if we were thinking about then academy football, and if we look at the different age groups, so for instance, the foundation phase, the young players, 8s to 11s or even younger,
Yeah.
What would be the ideal? I mean, when I first started, there was the Barleys long-term player development model. That was the big thing about, this was the golden age. Is that? I mean, I know you've spoken previously about that. Maybe that's not really. Is that not as thought of as gospel anymore?
I think Isfaham Barley's model, whilst it was really informative at the time, I think sometimes didn't make intuitive sense to those working at the top end of sport. So I certainly, although I was working with high performing athletes, in terms of their physical preparation, some of them were still beginners really. So if you followed that logical progression of windows of opportunity, and if you missed a period of training that you weren't going to be able to optimise your speed work, that didn't really make sense, because I firmly believe, even working in first team football, I can make a player faster. I can make them stronger. They might not be the fastest player in the world, but I can make them a better version. So I think whilst it was useful and whilst it helped, I think models and frameworks are exactly that. They're just a framework. They're a consensus opinion. It's not always what happens on the ground. I think probably one of the more contemporary models put forward by Rodri Lloyd and his research group is probably a more balanced framework, that although it highlights that there will be periods of training where the body will be more where you're going to get better training adaptations, we can train all things all of the time. We just need to turn the volume up on certain elements. So it's not like you're going to, if you miss speed development at a certain age, that you're never going to get an opportunity to get that back. Of course you can. So I prefer Rodri Lloyd's model. I think it's a more practical model that's more relevant for current training.
So I mean, but is there? I mean, you say that obviously the opportunities are still there later on, but is there a feeling that at the younger age groups there's more opportunity than maybe when you get older?
I think you've probably got more chance to influence training adaptations. But then if we look at something like strength, it's understanding how those strength adaptations come about. So prepubescent athletes, the strength gains are going to be primarily neural in adaptations. It's going to be through learning movement patterns and skills rather than structural adaptations, which won't come about until puberty. So if we look at boys and girls when they're developing, developmentally in terms of their movement and their strength development, they'll be very similar until they go through puberty, and then obviously physical adaptations will occur because of hormonal responses and changes in their physical makeup, which means that boys will typically be stronger than girls. So I think it's just understanding how the body develops, where you can get your gains, and the types of activities you can use to enhance, for instance, strength at various ages.
And what about things like agility, Nick? I mean, for me, that's a massive thing I've noticed working as a skills trainer.
Yeah.
The improvement in young players' agility, movement, their weights, things like that. I mean, what's your thoughts on that? Is that an early age a key opportunity to develop agility, or is that the same as across the board?
So again, I think it's understanding agility, what that actually means. So our understanding is far better now that there's a distinct difference between agility and change of direction. So agility is any sort of movement where there is a decision-making skill that has to come into it, where you don't know the course that you're running, where you maybe start from a different stimulus. So that's a specific skill on itself. You've then got the component parts that probably link to that, like change of direction, acceleration, deceleration, linear speed. So we have to understand why a player may not look like he's got good agility on the pitch. It could be because of one of those underlying components. They may not be able to accelerate, they may not be able to decelerate, they may not be able to change direction. that may be influencing the way they move on the pitch in terms of agility. So I think it's about movement, particularly with kids. It's about, and if you look at that foundation phase, just exposing them to a wide range of movements that they're going to encounter in the game, and even movements that they may not encounter or typically encounter. So we often think about agility as a running-based activity, but it's falling, it's rolling, it's tumbling, it's hopping, landing. I've been to some academies. One that springs to mind is Manchester City, and some of the stuff you see them working with the young athletes there is fantastic. It probably on first inspection doesn't look anything like a typical football drill, but it's running, it's jumping over and landing in awkward positions, which is what you're going to experience on the pitch as a senior and developing athlete.
Do you think then, I've noticed that the clubs I've worked with, and I've been fortunate enough to work with some great movement specialists, and also when I visited Ajax, they did a lot of stuff like judo and other sort of stuff. Do you think this sort of more flexible, less sort of rigid things like, for instance, ladders, there's less use of ladders now, maybe more use of other things, more, creative movements. What's your thoughts on that? What's your thoughts on one, the use of ladders, and then two, how that's evolved into a more dynamic way of doing things?
Yeah, so if we look at ladders and typically speed ladders, the name's probably wrong because it won't really help develop acceleration, deceleration, linear running speed. So the name's probably a little bit sends people down the wrong track. In terms of patterning, so footwork patterning and footwork drills, I think they have an application. I think that application is still relatively limited. Particularly with senior players. I think there's other simpler ways of chasing that. However, if you're working with 5 to 11-year-olds, do they like running through ladders? Do they enjoy it? Yeah, so I think it has its place. It's just how we use it, the proportion of time we spend doing it, and understanding what we're trying to gain from using that tool. It's pointless if we just roll out a bunch of ladders and people get very good at running set patterns, because that's not what we see on the pitch. We see that on YouTube and social media, people that look great doing these drills but actually probably not got anywhere near a first team or a representative level team. So I think they have a place. I think for other activities, exposing children to and young athletes to a variety of training stimulus again is important. I think probably where some of the academies and some of the youth coaches have gone wrong is not necessarily understanding what the benefit of that activity is and how to engage with the children. So I think we've gone from sort of early specialisation, and there's a recognition that we want early diversification in movement, so exposure to lots of different types of movements. So all of a sudden you see a curriculum that has half an hour of parkour, half an hour of basketball, 20 minutes of street dance, and it on paper it looks very attractive, but it's almost a cosmetic exercise, and there's not necessarily a huge amount of thought about, okay, if we're going to play basketball, what is it we're trying to get from basketball? The technical skills aren't transferable, but what is transferable is, for instance, working in a tight, confined space, having to make decisions very quickly under pressure. So that's the element that you can work, but sometimes it's not given enough time in the curriculum to be done properly, or we don't understand what the training purpose is. So we have this very superficial program that looks great to the outsiders. Oh, they're doing multi-sports, but doesn't actually give the youth athlete anything in terms of physical or tactical preparation. So I think, again, exposure to multi-sport and lots of different training stimulus is useful. It just has to be done with a logical viewpoint.
So, that brings me on to my next question, because, like I said, I've noticed that big increase in use of multi-sport in that term, and I've seen clubs sometimes they'll do, a sport for half a term, they'll just do a sport. But my question is, how much of this work do we have to do for it to become transferable? How much, extra movement do we have to do with these young players, for instance, for it actually then to transfer into them gaining those gains, or it not being actually useful?
That's a terrific question. So I don't know if I've got an. I think it will be different for each player and each squad that you're working with. I'm not sure I could say, it's a 6-week delivery that you need, and it's 20 hours of exposure. Sometimes it may be that, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, let's say you went and took a team to practice some basketball. It could just be putting them in that for a session, makes them realise how confined the space is, and that might give them one thing that they've never thought about before. So they could get an instant improvement off of that one session. But, probably our gut instinct would tell us we're going to need more exposure than just one session. It needs to be over extended periods of time throughout the course of their career, really.
So, I understand that's probably difficult to quantify that, isn't it? But for instance, say if you came into my academy, I've got an academy, and we're training 3 times a week, like 2 hours a session. What would you recommend us doing, like, for instance, weekly, as a percentage to give those players some really excellent movement outcomes, some alternative outcomes, rather than just the specialising in football? Would you recommend doing a little bit each session, maybe, or once a week doing a slot, or how could we maximise our gains for our young players to really improve their athletic development?
I think sometimes, rather than having a specific slot of basketball or parkour or whatever, maybe the coaches or the specialists to look at how you can integrate it into the football work that you're already doing, and so that you've almost hidden it within the work that you're going through, so that at a young age you need time on the ball, you need to build your football specific skill set. So that's going to be the priority. I still think that's the priority, but there may be lessons you can learn from, say, a judo player in terms of how they roll and fall, and you could incorporate that into the warm up, so that rather than just having a once a week exposure, every time they do a warm up, they're doing a forward roll, or they're being pushed off of out of balance. So I think it's what I tend to find when I work, having worked across a lot of sports, is it's trying to take key elements from each sport and seeing how they can integrate into the existing sports practice, and not necessarily bolting on a curriculum of judo or cricket or hockey. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I agree. Listen, I'm obsessive about technical training, getting players on the ball as much as possible. Yeah. I suppose the other argument that other people would say was actually, because of the bringing the risk of early specialisation, taking them out of the game for a bit, out of football, and giving them some other sorts of things. But my thing is that I think from working like the ball mastery and manipulation stuff, actually you get so many different movements, and force players to do differently. You actually get those sorts of different movement outcomes as well.
Yeah, I think everyone likes to polarize opinion on all sorts of topics. So you're always going to have people that are adamant that early specialisation is the key, and others that early diversification. I think unfortunately it's probably a little bit more boring than that, and it's a bit more of the middle ground. I think a sport like football, we've created it, we've turned it into an early specialisation sport. We probably didn't need to, but that's where we're at now. It is an early specialisation sport, whether we like it or not. So what I think that means is that if you've got children from a very young age focusing solely on football, and whilst we acknowledge that the technical training is incredibly important and they do need time on the ball, I think we also need to recognise they may be missing some simple movement skills that we could introduce into their training without the detriment of, we're taking 3 hours away from your tactical stuff. We're just adding it into existing practice. I think that's where it's going to move to. The coaches being able to subtly add in elements of small-sided court drills into a game, or falling skills or tumbling skills, without necessarily saying, okay, we're going to take you down to the circus school and we're going to spend an hour there. I think we can probably hide it a little bit better in what we're doing, or incorporate it better into what we're doing.
So in terms of then individual players, so we get a lot of players in academies who get released because they can't run, as it said, by recruitment staff or something like that. So how can we, a young player to begin, can we make that player quicker? Can we make that player more explosive? I mean, and what sort of things do we have to do if we can do? How can we help that player?
It's an interesting one. I went to a presentation at the start of the year. I was speaking at the Football Science and Football Conference, and Nick Levitt from the FA gave a really good presentation about talent identification. And his opening slide was 3 frogs sat on a branch. I'm not sure if you've seen the presentation. So you've got 3 tree frogs, and I hope I do his presentation justice. But essentially, there's one that's kind of clinging on for dear life. There's one that looks like it's struggling just to get onto the branch, and there's one that's sat on the branch quite relaxed. And Nick says, pick a frog. Which frog do you want? And, you look at a frog, and do you want the one that's sat on the branch that's quite comfortable? It's already made it, so it's relaxed. Do you want the one that's clinging on for dear life, doing everything it can do to stay on the branch? Or do you want the one in the middle that's kind of neither on nor off? And I think that's a little bit like talent identification. And that's what Nick's point is, that do we really know at such a young age that the one that's hanging on for dear life, the one that can't run quickly and is being released, do we really know that's the case, that they're not going to then develop later in life and be a very good professional player? I think, clearly academies have to make decisions about who stays and who goes. But, I don't think you're necessarily washed up by the time you're 18, 19. There's examples of players that do make it into first team football at the highest level that start a little bit later. They're probably not as many of those, but I think sometimes we probably label people that they're slow and they've just not developed yet. They've just not grown into that body.
Listen, I agree. I mean, I've heard in the past, they're one-paced and they can't run for players in the foundation phase, and that really pains me as well. But my thing is that, listen, say for instance, like another example, then with growth spurts and stuff like that, players who grow up and they suddenly lose their balance and coordination. I mean, also for parents, or for players aspiring to get into the program and academy football, what can they do to improve their speed by themselves? If they're going to try and do it, and how much time or what sort of things would they have to do?
I think you work. It's always about fundamentals. It's always about doing the basics. So you can find very simple drills, so simple running mechanic drills that will make you. That are used as low-level conditioning that are really good. It's working on acceleration, your first 3 to 5 steps, and there are some very easy training methods that can be used for that. It's then working on specific changes of direction. I think the problem that happens is that's kind of all the boring stuff. What people want is parachutes and bungees and ladders and drills that look very football, and look great on 30-second clips on Instagram. And unfortunately, that's what the kids get kind of lured into. But actually, that's not affecting performance. We've just, at the club that I work at, we've had several experts in speed and power development come into our club. And, independently, they're all saying very similar things. There's probably some basic drills that we know that are going to work. And then for the developing athlete, once they start to hit puberty, structural changes and adaptations are going to come about in terms of strength. So we know that a stronger athlete will be a more powerful athlete. A more powerful athlete will be a quicker athlete. So sometimes it's just purely giving them opportunity to sort of develop into that body and then lay down some good strength qualities. And we see it even in first team players that have been playing first team Premiership football for a number of years, who you think, tradition would tell you can't make them any faster. Well, I can tell you right now, you can, because we do. Year on year, we can make players that are with us quicker by addressing some of the underpinning physical capacities that maybe haven't been developed in the past, like strength.
So you talk about those simple drills. How often would I have to do those things to get quicker? Obviously not me. But a younger man who's a younger male or female footballer who wants to get into the game, and I think, right, I want to improve my speed. Because listen, let's be frank. If speed is such an important commodity in football, if I can improve it, why not? How much currency? Yeah, exactly. So how much would I have to do, and what do I have to do?
Yeah, interesting. We had a guy in yesterday, and one of our players said, "How often should I do these drills?" And the expert said, "As often as you can." And so I think with the speed work, it has to be high quality with minimal fatigue. So that's the key. It can't just become a slog fest where you're just doing drill after drill after drill. So it has to be high quality. You can do it daily. We know that speed is probably one of the physical qualities that's the most that is the least robust. So we know that in first team football, we want to expose our players to some sort of speed stimulus every week, every 7 to 10 days as a minimum. So I think on a daily basis, people can be working on speed, but that doesn't mean they always have to be running fast. That could be doing some wall drills up against the wall, making sure you've got good body alignment, making sure you're strong from the head through to the toe. It could be doing some simple running drills. It may be learning how to land from a jump and decelerate, because that teaches you the force absorption that you need to put the brakes on and decelerate. So I think typically our perception of speed work and agility work is always just running drills. Whereas sometimes we do need to break it into its component parts and work those. So you could work the component parts on a daily basis, so long as the quality was there and the opportunity to recover was there.
I mean, I'm lucky to work with a young movement specialist, Hailu Theodoros, a fantastic young man. He does a lot of stuff like that, a lot of jumping, landing, rolling, very dynamic. I notice what he does. So I've had a lot of good experience with that. My question would be, though, say we have an individual who has some movement issues. Would you take him out and do some stuff by himself, or set him some homework, and can you have an effect on those sorts of players?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Yeah, look, I like working with an underdog. I love it when people tell me something can't be done. So let's make it happen. I think what you have to understand is you can't turn an elephant into a kangaroo. So, but can we make them a better version? So they might not have the capacity to be a Usain Bolt, but can we make them a more effective version than they are? And I think absolutely we can optimize every player, every young player's physical performance and their potential. So I think as the coach, what you have to decide is, do you take them out and isolate them and give them extras, or do you try and incorporate it and overload it in a way within the session? Again, it will depend on the individual that you're working with, how they would cope with that. I think the best thing to do is, again, trying to put your movement skills and the physical qualities you want into existing practice, and having opportunities to explore acceleration or strength or landing mechanics within a structured football session.
Okay, cool. So then, thinking about we're moving up to the older age groups, when they, the 12 to 16 youth development phase. What did you think? Was that going to be the similar thing then? Would you approach it similar, or when they're getting a bit older, would you try and look at things a little bit differently?
I think my approach is very similar across all age groups. It's about fundamentals, getting the basics right. Well, obviously, once you get to that youth development, we're going to start going through puberty and probably even greater peaks in growth. So you just need to be mindful about when those growth spurts are taking place, and how you may want to adapt some of your training to that to accommodate them growing into their bodies and developing that coordination. And that might be a time where you actually really work quite hard on the movement aspect of it, because they've all of a sudden changed stature, they're growing into their bodies, and it's when they become sort of like a little bit like Bambi on ice, or the sort of ungainly newborn giraffe. That's when you need to probably work with players to re-educate them to learn how to land. And I'm sure you've seen in your experience players that have looked great then go through a growth spurt, and you're like, what's happened? They're kind of all over the place.
Well, I've seen players all ages, they go through that and they never get it back, and that's sort of my interest. Is actually a lot of Now, what can we do? Can we support these players who show great promise and they go for a growth spurt and then actually they never manage to get that hand-eye or hand-foot coordination back, and unfortunately they get lost to the game.
I think we probably need to do a better job of supporting those players, recognising that it's happening, and then recognising why they may be looking so uncoordinated, and again trying to figure out appropriate drills and sessions that will give them a chance to be successful, rather than letting them become lost in the system, because we'll naturally focus our attention on the kids that are doing really well, and it's like, oh, this guy's moving like a bucket of wet cement, so they then start to go onto the periphery. I think we need to work on those. There can be some superstars in that group.
Well, that's what I think maybe we could have done better in the past, and maybe in the future to do better. Is like you say, is that those players who show great promise, and then they go for that growth spurt, and it's like, oh well, he just hasn't got it anymore. But
so in my presentation on youth development that you've been to, I present some of the research that looks at the difference between near elite, sub elite, and elite performers. And typically, the sub elite performers that don't quite make it are often the ones that are better at the very beginning. So they're the one that we focus all of our attention on. And it's actually the people that go on to become elite are the ones that maybe weren't training quite so much, weren't quite moving as well, but have stuck at it and have grafted. And at a particular point in their life, in their mid-teens, make a conscious decision to be better. And I think sometimes we focus just on the really good players because we're driven by outcome goals, wins, losses. And again, I appreciate the pressures that are on coaches, staff, and they want to have successful academies and bring fruit. So the biggest, strongest kid will be the one that comes through. Whereas maybe the long game is looking for the little scrappy kid that's always struggling, because that might in itself give them something that's a little bit special. And I know, listening to youth coaches talk about how they set up games and practice, trying to make it successful for the smaller kids that are struggling. That's one way, but sometimes that little bit of struggle is probably a good thing.
Well, I think I agree. My issue with that is that I agree that those little ones come through, but a lot of times they get lost as well, because there is such a big emphasis on physicality in English football that the big boys who, like you say, that those short-term gainers who dominate and win you games, they're the ones a lot of times get picked, and those little ones sometimes get through, but a lot of times I think they might get lost because they can't, because it is such a physical fight. I
think there's a couple of points I make in the workshop that I've delivered, is that I asked the question. I make the statement, I don't care if you're a 13-year-old superstar. I really don't. I love it when I listen to people on the radio and television saying, oh, we found the next Messi and he's 9 years old. Come and talk to me when he's a senior player, because there's a lot that can go on. I don't care. It's easy to be a superstar as a kid, because a lot of that will just come down to how physically bigger or stronger or quicker you are. Come and talk to me when you're a senior. So that's the one thing. And then the other is, I think we just need to create athletes, first and foremost, that then just happen to play football, rather than always focusing on, I think we just need to spend a little bit more time and be in it for the long haul. And as the academy coaches, you might not get the payoff and the praise, but that scraggy, uncoordinated player that's not quite as good might go on to be an absolute superstar.
Well, I was talking to the technical director of the Croatian FA the other day, and he said that he felt that in England and France there's too much emphasis on physicality, and that's why the younger age group players dominate so well. But when they get older, they don't do as well, because in Croatia they have more of they look at the footballing brain, and then they try and develop the player around that.
The FA they took a study group out to South America, and again I've used some of those quotes from coaches out there, and it's allowing the kids to fail, to have problem solving, to figure stuff out on the pitch without constant intervention, and to do stuff that's hard sometimes. That's how we figure stuff out. Stumbling babies. If you spoon feed people all the time and make it easy, and I think I'm seeing this at some academies where the setups are fantastic, but they're too fantastic.
Yeah.
One of those kids goes out on loan to a Div 1 or Div 2 club, they're going to get a shock. because their drinks bottle won't be prepped for them. They won't have a perfect pitch, and that, sometimes I think we can suffocate with the type of training we do. I know we've got a bit off topic there, but yeah.
Well, no, yeah, that's what's the term I borrowed from Dave Collins. He talks about the rocky road to success, about having those bumps in the roads. And if you don't have that, then you're gonna struggle to create an elite player, because as soon as you get to the first one, then they crumble.
Yeah, and I think we probably see examples of that in all sports, but particularly we're interested in football. We probably see those examples in first team football.
Interesting. So so now talking about first team football, they're moving up into the older age groups, 18 plus, the pro development phase, and professional game. How would you approach that? Your movement and development of the sports and conditioning things.
Same answer as for all the other age groups. We work on the basics. We don't. I guess the thing that we have in first team football is we are tighter on time. We don't have as much time with the players. So we were just talking about this yesterday. The academy obviously has, through EPPP and various directives, they'll have more contact and more training volume. Clearly, once you get to first team, it's about results on a weekend or midweek. So the total sort of training exposure we get is a lot more limited, and that will also be driven by the philosophy of the head coach and the makeup of the team. So you may have teams that have very highly skilled players, technically really competent and playing in European football. They're going to be very time tight. They're not going to have a lot of opportunity. Whereas you may have more mid-table teams that haven't got European involvement, maybe an aging squad, and then you've got opportunities to expose them to different stimulus. So we typically will have elements of physical conditioning all week, and we either have it as part of a movement preparation session before they go out onto the pitch, a specific strength or power session twice a week before they go onto the pitch to train, or within the fitness coach's warm-up prior to the football practice. So we incorporate elements throughout the week of speed, of power, of strength, of movement, depending on where we are in the week.
And so, say if I'm in a young, like a 16-year-old, 17, 18-year-old, or an adult, and I'm preparing for a trial at a club, what should I do? Do you think? What should my training week look like? How do I get my body ready for that experience?
I think I'm difficult to give definitive answers, but I think what we've experienced when players have come up from the academy, it's probably the intensity and being with those seniors is. I'm not sure how you can prepare for that other than being in it.
I mean, so for instance, say I've got a trial coming up, and and I want to try, and I haven't been training that much, and I'm going to train 3 or 4 times a week. What sort of things? I'm not a sports conditioning specialist, so I want to generalise. How much time should I spend on aerobic or anaerobic or VO2 max, that sort of thing? If I'm going to construct a program by myself, everyone's on YouTube and Google these days.
Yeah.
What sort of things should I be focusing on to prepare myself for that intensity?
Yeah, the problem is it will vary so much for the individual because it depends on where the gaps are in their game. But if we had to give general advice, there would need to be, I would suggest, two strength elements in there a week. So 2 dedicated training sessions that work on strength and power in the gym. What that might look like is going to be very different for each individual, but I think strength underpins much of our physical qualities out on the pitch, but also makes a robust player, injury-free, long career. I then think, in terms of your central adaptations, your cardiovascular adaptations, that will be positional differences in terms of what you need to be able to achieve. But again, there's probably going to be 2 to 3 exposures of some sort of cardiovascular conditioning, whether that's intervals or whether it's a slightly longer efforts, intensive or extensive efforts, will depend again on the individual. And then you're definitely going to need a speed And by speed, it could be change of direction, it could be agility, it could be linear acceleration, or a combination of those in a session. You're probably going to need at least one of those, bare minimum. But if you can add little elements into that on a daily basis, then you'd put that in. I know that's a really sort of nebulous answer.
Well, I suppose it's difficult, right, to generalise. I'm saying, for instance, if you're going to say, okay, you just met someone and say, look, I've got a trial coming up in 3 weeks. How much time should I be spending on the long runs, or should I be doing interval training on the machines? Or you talked about those dynamic movement things. How often do I have to do those to get myself ready? Yeah. And obviously, look, there's no replication for being game fit as that. But I mean, you've got how do you give yourself the best chance to be successful?
I'd have them doing it would be daily. They'd have daily exposures. So like I say, 2 to 3 strength hits. There would be probably a daily CV hit, which would be different in nature each day, and then there would be an element of speed development in there every day. And I think what we've seen with players that have come up is it's that intensity, particularly on pre-seasons, is it's like all of a sudden you're in with senior pros that know how to manage their body and manage their weeks and their training. And I think that's a bit of a dark art. It's like you've got to be exposed to that, and probably the same on trials. I'd imagine there's a certain way to handle those trials and handle yourself within them to give yourself the best sort of shot window.
Well, obviously with the technique, I mean that really drops, right? Once you starts getting fatigued. I told the players I work with a lot of players who are going on trial and getting them technically ready. I say they've got to be physically ready as much as possible, because if they're even there 80 or 90% or whatever, the concentration drops, and that has a big impact on technique, right?
Yeah, absolutely. With fatigue, with poor nutrition, poor hydration, you will get fatigue, and then with fatigue comes poor decision making, poor technical execution, and potential for injury. So there's lots of research coming out now that shows that a chronic training stimulus is protective in terms of injury reduction. And we know that a player or an athlete's, within any sport, their performance characteristics on the pitch are heavily influenced by their physical characteristics off the pitch. There'll be some experts that will have you believe that everything should be done by football. However, I think that's a bit of a viewpoint that's just out there to try and polarise opinion. It's not as simple as that.
So in terms of like training loads, just talk about this briefly, then just for young players, how much should they or could they do? Everyone's, we're talking about, the clamour for doing more hours. How much recovery time do players need? And how much football and multisport can we give them?
So the 10,000 hours thing that came out is just led everyone down a blind alley, really. It's not even true. It's one of those consensus opinion that then becomes fact. And what that's led to is a bit of a results by volume approach. Let's just do more stuff. Let's do 10,000 hours. Let's get the box ticked. When actually it's the quality of work. If you actually read a lot of that research, and it's not just about practicing, it's about practicing constructively with intent and making sure it's high quality. So recovery is very important. Again, the structure a week, just off the top of your head, it's very difficult to do unless you've got a specific person in front of you.
Well, so for instance, we've got got your foundation phase. The academy director comes to you and say, look, we want to increase our training time to 5 days a week. One of those days a week is going to be a sport. Is that okay? Physically, that those demands on the player are going to be all right.
No pressure. I think our young athletes have a lot more capacity to do work than normal. I think what we then have to look at is be mindful of everything else that's going on in their life, and it will change as they're going through school. The pressures that are being placed upon them there. We have to take into account all the additional stresses that they're exposed to, not just the training, but I think if you can keep a track of like a simple training diary, just to give an insight into the amount of training, the type of training that's taking place, and maybe some simple questions about how they're feeling. You can then start to get a feel for, okay, look, last month we overcooked it. We were doing way too much. It meant too many late nights. And whilst we feel that extra sports session is giving us a benefit, actually what they need from it is the ability to absorb force, and we can incorporate that into our existing practice rather than bolting on another session. So I think, again, I feel like I'm not giving you any definitive answers, but that's because it's quite difficult. I think what you need to do is have strategies to monitor what you're looking at, and knowing your players and knowing when, okay, they've got a big exam period coming up. Whilst we think having 5 sessions a week is really good, let's just cut it down to 3, but make sure those 3 are really high quality.
Okay, cool. So thinking about that then, obviously loading, say for instance, I'm a coach and I have a team 1 hour a week, and this is the thing. So what can I do to be creative to then, improve my athleticism in my players while still, getting them on the ball and letting them obviously play as much game time as possible?
So with the sessions that I coach with the FA, when we're looking at that youth development sort of phase, is time on the ball is going to be the most important thing, especially if you've got an hour. I mean, geez, they've got to play football, right? So it's then, I think, within the warm-up and the cool-down, I think it's times when you can play a little bit more, like have games that maybe superficially don't look like they're related to anything that you're doing, but actually have elements of force production, force absorption, speed, agility. So I think you can add those in. So warm-up and cool-down are great places to incorporate some of that movement. I then think for every drill that you're trying to run, looking at, okay, if we broke that drill down into its component parts, what do we think are the 1 or 2 elements that are really going to unlock the door? What's going to make that kid really agile? What does agility mean in this drill? Is it the ability to put the brakes on and turn 90 degrees? So you can run the drill and then, intersperse it with the specific physical quality, a much simpler drill. So it's like whole part whole. So it's incorporated throughout rather than always being an added bolt-on separate session. Because I think if it's always bolted on, when you're tight on time, we'll do that at the end, and then the end never comes, and it's always just football. So I think trying to incorporate it into the football is key.
Lovely, thanks for that, Nick. Now, just finally, so obviously, there's lots of really keen coaches out there. How can they find out more about the stuff that you do and all that, your excellent work, and improve their knowledge in this area?
So I am on Twitter, so Coach Nick G on Twitter, and I'm on Instagram, although the Instagram's probably less of a vehicle, but 0226 is my thing on Instagram. You won't find 30-second video clips of me wearing tights and sharp haircuts running through ladders.
Doing parachutes.
No. So if that's what you're after, don't look there. But Twitter, I'm on there quite a lot, and I put up research articles and point people to people that I believe are doing great work in sports science and strength and conditioning. We've also got the club that I work at West Brom. We've got a Twitter, which is Strength WBA, so that's worth having a look at there. And we share the type of insights we're doing with the work with the first team. And then if people are interested in me specifically, NickGrantham.com, and I've also got a book which I'm going to plug shamelessly, The Strength and Conditioning Bible, which was kind of written for that end user, people that are into their sport, that want to put in place some simple and effective programs, but don't necessarily need the super hard science to baffle them. They just want to get on and do it in simple terms.
Well, I can definitely vouch for that book. I've got it and read it, and I've found it really beneficial just to give me, as a coach working across the age ranges, give me a bit of background knowledge about what I'm doing and how can I affect that area. So yeah, I definitely encourage people to get that one.
Thank you very much.
Nick, thanks very much. Appreciate your time. It's been invaluable, and good luck, and I'll hopefully speak to you soon.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in to the MyPersonalFootballCoach.com Soccer Player Development Podcast. MyPersonalFootballCoach.com's Dynamic Ball Mastery Program is the world's leading online individual technical training program, proven and developed at the highest level in the English Premier League. Sign up now to train like the pros and take your game to the next level. Master the ball, master the game.